The anal stage is the second stage, and it occurs between the ages of 1 and 3 years old, around the time when kids are going through toilet training. And it has a lot to do with toilet training activities and how the parents approach toilet training and how they treat the child during toilet training. During the anal stage, pleasure is obtained through the anus, through bowel movements, defecating, withholding poop, either going or not going, and also bladder control. And again, having to do with whether you pee or you refrain from peeing. And for a kid, this is a sort of a magical time. These are bodily products that they make themselves, and kids don't have a lot of control in the world. So it's just really cool to be able to make water or some sort of clay-like stuff, and they want to play with it, and they don't understand initially that it goes in the toilet and is not to be played with. And so the major conflict is over toilet training. Parents' attempts to get the child to go to the bathroom in the toilet, and the child's response to the parents' insistence that they not play with the poop and that they not soil themselves and that they actually plan ahead a little bit, or at least get themselves to the toilet in time. And parents can be rough at this. They can be gentle and permissive. There's a whole range of ways they may approach toilet training that have to do with parents' personalities and ways of handling situations. And so sometimes you won't know developmentally about what a child went through or an adult went through during the anal stage. But when you hear about their parents and how strict the parents are, whether they're punitive or supportive, you can sort of get a sense of what the experience might have been like. So again, the major conflict during this stage is over toilet training. How the parent tries to toilet train the child and how the child deals with these demands. And around this stage, kids will really challenge their parents regarding their decision-making powers versus the child's power to make their own decisions. So this is a control thing. The child wants to exert their own will and make their own choices, and the parents are insisting on particular behaviors. So later on, this sort of potentially traumatic interaction might influence how the child later deals with authority figures who try to assert their will on the child, and how they cope with demands from other authority figures, basically. So in a little bit more detail, again, the anal stage takes place between the ages of 1 and 3 years old. And this is the second societal conflict. The one associated with the oral stage was weaning and feeding. And the one associated with the anal stage is toilet training. And a child's success in negotiating the stage without becoming fixated is dependent on the parent's approach to toilet training, how patient they are, how severe the discipline is, how they approach the task. So if the parents appropriately reward the child for using the toilet in an acceptable manner, then the child's going to be more likely to successfully negotiate this stage. So if it's not overly punitive. If the parent, however, harshly punishes, shames, and ridicules the child's attempts, then the child might develop a fixation at this stage. One thing that can happen is a lot of times parents don't realize that children may not physically be able to control their bladder and their bowels up until a certain age, and kids vary a little bit on this. So it doesn't do any good to try to toilet train a child before they can actually control what's going on or sense what's going on. And so that can cause a fixation too. But if the child successfully resolves this conflict and gets toilet trained without too much trauma, they'll learn boundaries, symbolically boundaries, and be able to control other behaviors and urges, and will have a sense of accomplishment, self-control, and independence. So it doesn't just have to do with toilet training, but also is one of their early encounters with rules and negotiating rules and learning how to control themselves. If conflict occurs, if things don't go well, though, they'll develop a fixation resulting in an anal personality or a urethral personality that I'll describe next. So fixation at the anal stage can result in one of two types of personality profiles. One is too rigid and the other is too unruly. The first one is an anal retentive personality, and this is the result of harsh toilet training. And in order to rebel, the child will hold back poop and not comply, because that's one of the few things that they have control over. When they grow up, they might develop into an adult who is very, very neat, can't tolerate messy, may even be obsessive, even obsessive compulsive, perfectionistic. On the other hand, or as part of this, they may be on time, so very prompt, and be respectful to authority, but not in a comfortable way. They can also be very stubborn, hoarding, and stingy with their money. So that's very, the withholding of poop may become a habit that's symbolic of withholding in general. So withholding money, collecting things, that sort of things. And other characteristics might be being asocial, which means not sociable. It doesn't mean antisocial, which is against people. It's just not very friendly. Selfish and suspicious. And these things are all the result of harsh toilet training. In terms of respect for authority, it might be dutiful, but they also may resent authority. The other sort of anal personality type is the anal expulsive personality, and this is the result of inadequate toilet training, so lack of boundaries and rules. If kids are allowed to relieve themselves at any time, at the wrong time in the wrong places, and allowed to soil their pants, then they might later develop an anal expulsive personality. And so when they're adults, they're messy, disorganized, maybe destructive and rebellious, because they really didn't learn how to comply with rules. They also may be very inconsiderate of other feelings. Again, they just don't have good boundaries in terms of what's acceptable and what's not. As an adult, they also may be wasteful. On the other hand, they may share things with peers because they're not stingy or withholding, and they may even give things away. So they're a lot looser than the anal retentive types. Most people, when they talk about the anal stage, they talk about withholding of number 2, poop, rather than urination. But pleasure is also experienced through control of the sphincter. This is an accomplishment for a child. And a fixation at this stage may result in something called a urethral personality or character. And it's a little bit different than a anal personality. Urethral personality develops from embarrassment and shame from wetting pants or wetting their bed, even though it's normal, though not necessarily desirable, for kids to wet their bed through age 5 or 6. After that, it's more unusual. But before that, kids wet their beds when they're young for quite a while, and they shouldn't be made fun of for that. Anyway, if they have this experience of wetting their bed and they know they're not supposed to, or they wet their pants in school and they know they're not supposed to, they might feel inferior to other kids, and they might strive to overcome this self-doubt and this failure on their part. So as a result, as adults, they are very envious of other kids because they've envied children who could control their bladder throughout their lives, and they might be more very ambitious and competitive, but they're not as direct and confrontational as kids with an anal personality, because they have a lot more embarrassment, because bedwetting is something that is shamed in elementary school. As adults, they may also be tempted to give in to schemes involving easy money, the fast buck. And there's no clear explanation for this, but it may have to do with also having trouble with rules and sort of had a failure of obeying the rules of not wetting your pants or wetting your bed, and some insecurities having to do with that during development. Something, just a comment I want to make. When we're talking about analyzing people and trying to figure out where things came from, it's rare that an adult especially, or even a child, will be able to tell you the details of their weaning and feedings, or their toilet training, or later on their crushes on their mothers or fathers. But you can still ask what the toilet training was like. They're not going to remember weaning. But the other way to look at this is if you get a good description of their parents from them, you can kind of figure out or guess at what the parents' typical response to discipline is. Or you could even ask the children what sort of disciplinarian their parents were. How did they handle conflicts or problems that came up? And that can give you an idea of how rough the toilet training or how regular the feedings would have been, and how parents dealt with other sorts of situations that might have ended up shaping the adult personality. So you can sort of look at it forwards and backwards. And when you're looking back, their descriptions of their parents and how their parents handled disciplining and teaching them is probably a good way to get at what their experiences might have been like. The third stage, and the last stage at which a fixation can occur, is the phallic stage. The phallic stage occurs between the ages of 3 and 6. And during this stage, the libido, or sexual energy, is focused on genitalia as a source of pleasure. So during the ages of 3 or 6, kids are also, according to most theories, exploring their gender identity, or figuring out whether they're boys or girls, if we're going to be binary about it. And so the curiosity may lead them to undressing and exploring each other and their and seeing what genitals each other has, and learning physical differences between girls and boys. And just learning that there are differences between boys and girls can alter their perceptions of their parents, who they also will feel compelled to categorize as male or female, or boys or girls. The other thing during this stage is they derive pleasure, and the societal conflict is that they want to fondle their genitals. So basically masturbation. So the social conflict, again, is control of masturbatory behavior. And attraction to their opposite sex parent, according to Freud. Freud didn't really deal that much with sexual orientation. And so my account during this particular lecture is going to be a little heterosexist. So in addition to the ways that parents handle children masturbating, which presents one societal conflict, because kids will start to masturbate in front of company, in public places, because it just feels good. They don't know it's not something you're supposed to do in public. And just like with toilet training, parents need to respond to that and try to get the child to not do that in public at the very least. The other thing is their attraction to their opposite sex parent, according to Freud. And for boys, they call this the Oedipus complex. And it's, of course, named after the Greek character Oedipus, who unknowingly kills his father and becomes sexually involved with his mother. And here you have a picture of Freud with his father. And this stage is characterized by father-son competition for sexual possession of the mother. And so once kids learn about gender roles and pairing up and relationships, supposedly, according to Freud, they get attracted and want to have their opposite sex parent. And you probably at least will have heard little girls saying they want to marry their fathers, or little boys saying they want to marry their mothers. And that's sort of the surface evidence of this sort of phenomena, at least occurring, even if it doesn't mean or occur in the same way that Freud describes it. Anyway, so the boy's sexual desire becomes directed at his mother, and he competes with his father and becomes very jealous of his father because his father sleeps with his mother. Some boys will even have a fantasy about killing their fathers, like Oedipus, in order to have their mothers to themselves. So that's the first piece of how this works. So the next part of what happens is that the boy becomes fearful that his father might figure out that he's competing for mom and castrate him. which creates castration anxiety. His ego decides not to challenge the physically stronger father, who could kill him. That's the fear, or castrate him. But this ego-id conflict is repressed. Some of this may not be consciously experienced. But basically, the boy figures out that I can't beat him. If I can't beat him, I might as well join him, and tries to become more like his father. So the boy engages in what's called identification. He becomes more like his father. He incorporates his father's personality characteristics, moral values, gender role behaviors, as well as other behaviors into his ego, his self. And this reduces castration anxiety because he's no longer competing with mom, but also because his similarity to his father pleases the father and protects the boy from his father's aggression. And the important part of this, another important part of this for development, is that his father's internalized moral values become the boy's superego. So those moral values that he incorporates from his father make up his own moral values. And that is when the development of the superego, or basically a conscience, develops. Now, there can be problems if, and all this is driven, the motivation is the fear of castration. Problems occur, though, if there's no father figure to compete with, and so he gets, or let's say, either symbolically or realistically. So, for instance, if the mother likes the boy better than her husband, even if she doesn't actually have sexual relations with him, the boy will have considered himself to have won, and he may not adopt the father's moral values. Or you could have a father who has awful moral values and he adopts those, and then that can lead to problems. Or there can be no father in the picture at all. So again, and that would make him an edible victor. Either winning the father, or being liked more than the father, or having no father there can both make the child an edible victor, in which case he'll develop a phallic personality, which I'll describe next. So if the boy doesn't resolve his Oedipal complex, either because there's no father to compete with, or his mother likes him better than his father, so he sort of symbolically wins, he may end up with a phallic stage fixation, in which case he will develop some of the characteristics I'm going to talk about here. It's driven by the remnants of castration anxiety. But because he never internalizes his father's values, or if his father has poor moral values, his superego development is disrupted. In other words, he doesn't develop a good conscience or an appropriate conscience. He may become aggressive and overambitious. He might symbolically compete with other men throughout his life, just like he competed and beat his father. And so, for instance, Bill Clinton, biological father died in a car accident before he was born, and then his mom remarried this guy with a bad alcohol problem who she was pretty disgusted with, and so she really doted on Bill Clinton more than she did his stepfather. And therefore you might say that maybe Bill Clinton developed a phallic personality and continued to compete as a politician because, after all, he beat Dad the first time. And so he continues to, compete, be competitive and ambitious, and compete with other men. The other thing that boys with phallic personalities do is that they become very vain and preoccupied with their own sexual attractiveness. They might be very self-centered and egotistical, and also be a big flirt. And they don't only just flirt, but they also follow through. So they're kind of promiscuous. In terms of moral development, they only respond reflexively to societal rules. So they act like their id would. So if something's painful, they get away from it. If something is pleasurable, they seek it out. But they're not so great if they don't have anyone's moral values to internalize. They're not so great at internalizing the right and wrong and rules and that sort of thing. And in a way that makes them feel guilty if they violate their moral values. And so they don't internalize a moral sense as well. They also may, when they get frustrated or tense, they might masturbate or seek out other sexual release. when tense or upset. And they tend to rebel against authority, sort of symbolic of, again, overthrowing father. So in the case of Bill Clinton, I mean, there was the competing with other men in the elections. There was the promiscuity. But he did seem to, in general, follow societal rules. And so people who are affected by phallic personality don't necessarily end up with all of its characteristics. But he also had his grandmother, who took care of him part of the time, was a very strict and organized and provided a lot of structure for him. So he had some mitigating factors that might have prevented him from becoming completely lawless. Just saying.